It's, about how can you create that moat around your company. And I think to your point, it's about making sure that you're prepared, and that you aren't blindsided when, quantum computing does actually, transform industry in the way that people are doing things. So I think you're 100% right in thinking about, innovation and, how can you better prepare yourselves for that not so distant future.
So, before we started recording, we were actually talking a little bit about this theme of innovation being much more accessible. It doesn't have to be locked up in Bell Labs or Xerox Park. It doesn't have to be locked up in Silicon Valley or, university labs around the world. How has that idea changed for you over the last 10, 15 years?
I think it's been turned upside down. Like we were saying before, I think innovation was almost seen as, this thing that lived in an ivory tower in San Francisco or Silicon Valley, where you had to be part of that ecosystem to innovate. But that's not the case anymore. And I think, when we look at like COVID, that certainly helped kind of like accelerate, the adoption of innovation, from anywhere. And so I think when we look at innovation today, it's actually a much more exciting environment because when we look at innovation, it can come from anywhere and anyone. You don't necessarily need to be in San Francisco or Silicon Valley. And I think it's evident when you look at just, what we're witnessing today with, things like generative AI, just the rate of change and the speed at, which we're seeing innovation. It's really exciting. I think, I've spoken to you before about this, but, when we looked at the Horizon model, you typically have Horizon 1, 2, and 3.
Sure.
I think folks kind of typically viewed that third horizon as almost being like, a few years away.
Yeah, I think it was originally framed as like the 5 to 10 year research bets.
Horizon 3 today, I would say, you could look at it as almost 6 months to a year. We see new things coming out every week. And I think, that's really kind of prompted this need for organizations to be prepared. You don't want to be blindsided. I think like many companies were when we saw like the emergence of Gen AI. So I think, if there's any point in time to be, at the tip of innovation, it's right now. And I think like when you look at my organization, we're focusing on things like Gen AI, but then also quantum computing. And you think like quantum computing, well, why Moody's? But when you look at quantum computing, that can completely completely turn around the way that you do like things like credit risk modeling, to be able to like perform calculations and run these models in an instant. That can completely disrupt your business model and turn it upside down. And I think when you look at quantum computing too, there's also security implications when you look at like cyber and encryption. So I think that there's certainly innovations that companies should be taking note of today. But then also when we look at the future, these things that we thought were so distant, they might be much closer than we actually think they are.
Well, and the thing is, they might be, but you don't know. You can see them coming, they're coming, but you don't know exactly when. And this is why, like, I actually kind of love this because I feel like you're talking out of one of my pitch decks. But like, you mentioned the word preparedness, right? I think quantum computing is such a cool example, right? Pretty sure it's coming. Pretty sure it's going to seriously upend what you're doing. Don't know exactly when, but it might be tomorrow. So what are you doing? You're investing in preparing
exactly
so that you can react so that the service you offer to your customers doesn't fall off a cliff. And I think that's such an important. I want the audience to pay attention to this because I think that is such an important point about the role of innovation teams and innovation leads inside large corporations, right? I think we often conflate innovation with R&D, new product development, new business creation, which it can certainly tie to these things. But innovation as a function that doesn't go off on its own and play around with the cool new toys, but that structurally helps, Moody's be prepared for a changing future.
Yep.
It sounds like you guys have your head screwed on straight.
No, yeah. I like to think we do. It's, about how can you create that moat around your company? And I think to your point, it's about making sure that you're prepared, and that you aren't blindsided when, quantum computing does actually transform industry in the way that people are doing things. So I think you're 100% right in thinking about, innovation and, how can you better prepare yourselves for that not so distant future.